18 years after I found her selling wilted flowers outside a grocery store, the woman who gave birth to my daughter pressed the key to a pearl-white Porsche into her palm and said, "You've proven you're worthy of coming home." Nora took the key. Then she turned and looked straight at me. I wish I could tell you I understood what was happening in that moment. I didn't. I stood near the back of the university pavilion with an envelope in my hand, a few $100s, folded around a note I'd written the night before. It was her graduation gift. It was the most I could set aside without touching the money I kept for the property taxes. And I had saved it a little at a time across the whole year. I wore the good suit, the one that had hung in my closet since my husband's funeral. I'd lost weight since then without meaning to, so the shoulders sagged and the waistband gathered where a belt tried to hold it. My shoes were older than the suit. They had started chafing my heels before the ceremony even began, and I could feel a raw spot forming with every step across that polished floor. None of it had bothered me, not until I saw the car parked outside, low and white and gleaming, with a thin ribbon laid across the hood like something out of a commercial. People were already lifting their phones. And then there was the woman standing beside my daughter, Vivienne Ashford. You didn't have to follow the business pages to know the name. It was carved into the glass of downtown towers and stitched into the awnings of hotels I had only ever cleaned the edges of. Never stayed in. She had the kind of quiet, expensive stillness that made an entire room straighten its spine without noticing it had. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Money like hers spoke in a register the rest of us instinctively lowered ourselves beneath. She held the leather key case out with both hands, the way you'd offer a gift you were certain could not be refused. Nora accepted it. And for one ugly second, I am not proud of this. I looked down at the cheap envelope in my hand and felt ashamed of it. Ashamed of the folded bills. Ashamed of the note. Ashamed of the 18 years those few $100s were somehow supposed to represent, standing there against a machine that cost more than my house. I had raised that girl. I had learned her nightmares by heart. I had sat on a bathroom floor at 3 a.m. more times than I could count, and I had never once let her see me cry about the bills. But standing in that pavilion, watching a stranger's diamond catch the light on my daughter's hand, I felt like the smallest person in the room. That is where this story ended up, but it is not where it began. It began 18 years earlier, on a bitter November night, outside a parking lot in Springfield, Ohio, where a freezing rain was starting to tap against my windshield, and a little girl I had never met was standing under a weak yellow light, holding 5 dying flowers, waiting for someone to stop. I was 51 that November, and I had just come off a 12-hour shift caring for an elderly man named Mr. Prewitt, whose family paid me to keep him company and keep him alive, mostly in that order. My back ached. My hands smelled like liniment. All I wanted was to get home before the roads iced over. That was when I saw her. A small girl stood near the cart return under a weak yellow light, her sweatshirt too thin for the weather, the cuffs swallowing half her hands. She held 5 flowers wrapped in damp newspaper, not store flowers, the kind pulled from some neglected yard, bent stems, browning at the edges. She stepped toward a man pushing a cart. "Would you like a flower? Sir, $1?" He walked past like she was made of air. She didn't complain. She just went back to the curb and waited. I rolled down my window. "You got a permit for this operation?" Her eyes went wide, ready to run. I raised both hands. "Easy, I'm teasing." "Do you want one?" she asked. "How much for all of them?" $5. I handed her a 10. She counted the flowers twice and held them out. "I don't have change." "Keep it," Her chin lifted. I'm not begging. I didn't say you were. Consider it a bulk order. That earned the smallest twitch at the corner of her mouth. Up close, I could see how cold she was. Her lips gone pale, rainwater dripping from her hair. I bought her dinner at the little counter inside. She refused twice, then agreed only when I said she could pay with her flower money. She ordered chicken and ate slowly, like someone trying not to be noticed. And halfway through, I watched her wrap 2 pieces in a napkin and slide them into her pocket. You saving those? I asked. For tomorrow. That was the moment something in my chest shifted and would not shift back. I stepped away and called the police. Quietly, I thought, not quietly enough. When I turned around, the chair was empty, and I caught a flash of her running through the automatic doors into the rain. The officers were kind. The social worker who arrived an hour later was kinder, and more tired than anyone I had ever met. Her name was Diane Whitfield, and she knelt in a wet parking lot in a brown coat and spoke to that girl like she was the only child in Ohio. The girl wouldn't answer. Diane pulled me aside. She ran from a foster placement yesterday. There was an older boy in the home taking her food, threatening her. Her mother left her with an acquaintance years ago and never came back. We haven't been able to find her. I heard myself say it before I'd decided to. What would it take for me to be the one who keeps her? Diane gave me a look I would come to know well, the look of a woman who had watched too many good intentions evaporate. It doesn't work that way, she said gently. A single woman who called the police on a child tonight doesn't get to take that child home. The county decides placement, not you. So, I didn't take her home. Real life is not a movie. But the next morning, I called Diane. I called again 3 days later. I signed up for the classes, the background checks, the home inspection, the training sessions, the interviews that felt less like conversations and more like being turned inside out. 8 months. That is how long it took. And it might have taken longer, except that after 2 more placements failed, the girl told Diane there was only one house she would agree to go to, mine. She crossed my doorway, carrying everything she owned in a single black trash bag. She stood in my living room and looked around like she was pricing the exits. How long am I staying? She asked. As long as they'll let you, I said. She didn't like that answer. For weeks she hid crackers under her mattress. She slept with her shoes beside the bed. Every morning she packed that trash bag before school, certain someone would come to move her again. One evening she knocked a glass off the counter and it shattered on the floor. She went rigid. Her hands stiffened at her sides and the color drained out of her face, and she looked at me the way you look at a storm you cannot outrun. I picked up the broom. It's a glass. Honey, we've got more. She stared at me. That's it. What else would there be? Her chin began to tremble. Then she sat down on my kitchen floor and cried until she could barely breathe, and I sat down beside her, not touching, just there, until she was done. Almost 2 years later, a judge finalized the adoption. Outside the courtroom, she held my hand and asked if it meant no one could send her anywhere else. Not, I told her, unless she planned to put me in a nursing home someday. She laughed. And she called me Mom for the first time. Back then, I believed her birth mother had vanished without ever knowing what became of her. I was wrong. People ask me what those years were like, and they always expect the big moments, the birthdays, the report cards. But that isn't how a home gets built. It gets built on ordinary Tuesdays, piece by piece, when nobody is watching. I remember a Tuesday when Nora was 10, and I brought home a rusted bicycle from a yard sale on Patterson Road. $12? She stood in the driveway with her arms crossed. You bought that? I prefer to think I made an investment in tetanus. We spent 2 Saturdays taking it apart and painting it blue. The first time she rode without training wheels, she made it half a block before tipping into a hedge, and when I rushed over, she snapped. "Don't! I can do it!" She climbed back on with blood running down one shin. That was Nora. She would accept a bandage eventually, but only after proving she could survive the cut alone. I remember the Tuesday the school called. She was 14, and she'd punched a boy in the cafeteria. He had called her a charity case after learning she was adopted. Part of me wanted to shake that boy's hand. Instead, I told her, "You're apologizing. He started it. He used his mouth. You used your fist. You don't get to take where you came from and turn it into a permit to be cruel." She didn't speak to me the whole drive home. I stopped for pie anyway. Over the crust, she muttered, "I hate when you sound reasonable." She apologized to that boy the next morning. She didn't mean every word, but she said them. I was not an educated woman. When Nora hit algebra, I sat at the kitchen table after my shifts and relearned it from library books so I could help her. When she got into anatomy years later, I did the same flashcards of bones and muscles spread across the counter next to the dinner. I was too tired to finish. Half the time, she'd lean over my shoulder and correct me, and I'd tell her that was part of the test. There were sacrifices I never told her about. The dentist appointment I canceled 3 years running because the money was better spent on her. The weekend shifts I took caring for other people's parents, telling her I'd picked them up because I was restless, because I was bored, because a woman my age needed something to do. She believed me, or she let me believe she believed me. I've never been sure which. When she was accepted into a doctoral program in physical therapy, a doctorate, my girl, the one who arrived with everything she owned in a trash bag, the scholarship covered tuition but not the rest, housing, fees, the deposit that had to be paid before the first check cleared. So I sold the boat. It was a 19-foot aluminum fishing boat with a faded green stripe and a motor that needed prayer on cold mornings. Walt and I used to take it out on the lake before he got sick. After he died, I kept it under a tarp in the side yard and took it out maybe twice a year. But seeing it there made me feel like some part of my old life was still waiting for me. A man from 2 towns over bought it for a little under $5,000. When he towed it away, the tires left 2 pale tracks in the grass. Nora came home that weekend and saw them. "Where's the boat?" "Sold it." "That was Walt's." "It was mine too." "That's not the point." "Mom," her voice cracked, "you keep giving things up for me." "I'm not giving up my life, honey. I'm choosing where to put it. You didn't take anything from me. I decided where it goes." She turned away and wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand and said, "One day, she was buying me another boat. I told her I'd settle for her paying her phone bill on time." What I didn't tell her was that my body had started sending me notices. My knees first, then the numb fingers after long drives, then the mornings I'd walk into a room and forget why. I began keeping a list on the refrigerator pills. Appointments, the small things a mind is supposed to hold on its own. I told myself it was age. I told her nothing, because the one thing worse than growing old, I had decided, was becoming the thing my daughter had to take care of. I had spent 18 years making sure she never felt like a burden. I was not about to become one. The night before her graduation, I sat at that same kitchen table and folded a few $100s into an envelope. It wasn't much. It was everything I could give without touching the tax money. I wrote a note by hand and tucked it inside. For whatever comes next, I had no idea what was coming next. If I had, I might have written something else. The ceremony ended, and the families moved to a reception in the engineering pavilion. That was when a dean stepped to the microphone and announced that a major donor wished to present a special award. Then Vivienne Ashford walked in, flanked by 2 assistants. And the room did that thing rooms do around money. It straightened up. She praised Nora's work. Innovation, discipline, a better future. Then her voice changed, and she turned toward my daughter. "There is another reason this young woman matters to me," she said. "I am her biological mother." Nobody cheered. For a few seconds, the only sound was the air conditioning. I looked at Nora, waiting for the shock to hit her face. It didn't. And that frightened me more than the announcement did. An assistant brought forward a red leather case. Inside was the key to the Porsche waiting beyond the glass wall. "You've spent years proving what kind of woman you are," Vivienne said, smiling. "You've proven you're worthy of coming home." Nora reached out and took the key. My fingers closed around the cheap envelope in my pocket. A second assistant stepped up with a cream-colored folder. "There's simply a family reconciliation agreement to formalize," she said smoothly. "It was sent to Ms. Ashford's attorney last week. Today is only our ceremony." No pen was thrust forward, no pressure in front of the crowd. It was gentler than that. And somehow worse, the paperwork already drafted, already delivered, the ending already decided. As if my daughter's signature were a foregone conclusion, and this whole room merely the set where it would be filmed. Because that is what it was, a set. I understood it then. Vivienne hadn't chosen a stage by accident. A tearful public reunion, a billionaire mother welcoming home the daughter she'd lost. It was an image, framed and lit, released to the world before anything uglier could surface. Generosity as a press release, guilt engineered into a room of 200 witnesses, so that saying no would look like cruelty. Bamo. But Nora didn't reach for a pen. She looked toward the third row and said, quietly, "I'd like my attorney to explain what this folder actually contains." A woman in a plain navy suit stood. No assistants, no security. "My name is Grace Bennett," she said. "I represent the independent trustee for the estate of the late Richard Ashford. I do not represent Mrs. Ashford." Vivienne's expression didn't move, but the pulse at the base of her throat did. Then Nora took a folded sheet from the pocket of her gown. "This is an investigator's report," she said. "Dated 2012. It says I was living with my adoptive mother in Springfield. It notes she'd taken extra weekend shifts. It notes I needed dental work, and it was straining her finances." She looked up. Someone was watching us. Someone wrote it down, and that someone knew exactly how hard my mother was working and never once sent a birthday card. The color left Vivienne's face. Grace opened her folder. "For the record," she said, "Nora does not inherit as Mrs. Ashford's daughter. Under the law, adoption severed that line years ago. She inherits for one reason only." She paused. "Richard Ashford's trust contains a clause he wrote himself. It provides for any biological child confirmed by DNA, regardless of adoptive status." I did not understand all of it, but I understood enough to feel the floor shift. It was not Vivienne who had quietly kept a place for my daughter. It was the man in the ground. Richard had suspected. Richard had wondered, all those years. Whether the child his family swore wasn't his, might have been his after all, and he had left a door open in his will. Just in case. He never came, but he remembered. "When the trustee reviewed the estate," Grace continued, "he found payments to private investigators buried in the company's books, labeled as risk management. Those records led him to Nora's address. to this report, to a DNA comparison. She closed the folder. The inheritance is not conditional. She does not have to sign anything. She does not have to move or change her name or stay silent about her childhood. The pavilion had gone very still. I turned to my daughter. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. You knew and you didn't tell me. For 3 weeks, she said. Why? Her eyes met mine, and they were not cold. They were tired. Because I needed to know why she was coming back before I let her anywhere near you. That was what broke me. Not that she'd done something wrong she hadn't, but that she had carried all of it alone. For 3 weeks, the way I'd carried the boat and the dentist and the list on the refrigerator alone. I had taught her that. God help me, I had taught her that. Vivienne took a step forward. Nora, we can discuss this privately. These people have their own agendas. Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she pointed at me. You didn't come back because I became your daughter, she said. You came back because a DNA test made me worth something to you. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You watched me for 18 years, but watching isn't the same as being there. She, the finger, steady, aimed at me. She was there. You stood at a distance and called it love. My mother showed up. For a moment, I thought Nora would hand the key back. Instead, she closed her fingers around it and looked at Vivienne. You said the car is mine, with no conditions, she said. I'm going to hold you to that. Vivienne nodded slowly, uncertain. Nora turned to Grace. Once the title clears, can we transfer it directly to a fund for kids aging out of foster care? Grace said yes. Nora looked back at the room. They'll auction it. The money can cover emergency housing, tuition, a car to get to work for children whose parents know exactly where they are and still don't come. The words landed harder than if she'd thrown the key through the glass. Vivienne's composure finally cracked. You'd give away a car worth more than most people's homes just to humiliate me. This was never about humiliating you. Nora set the unsigned folder on the podium. I'm not refusing to make peace. I'm refusing to let you pretend we were ever a family. Nobody applauded at first. The room simply held the words, and that made them feel more real. Then an older woman near the front began to clap, and a professor joined her. And within seconds, most of the pavilion was on its feet. I barely heard them. I was watching Vivienne leave before the applause stopped. Her assistant gathering the folder she'd been so certain would be signed. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong about that too. Someone had filmed the speech. By Monday, it was on local television. By Wednesday, national websites were running headlines about the foster child who rejected her billionaire mother. Some people called Nora brave. Others called her ungrateful. One man wrote that I had raised her to hate the wealthy, that I'd poisoned my own daughter against her real family. I read that sentence more times than a woman my age should admit to. Then Vivienne released a statement. She said she had reached out in good faith for a private reconciliation and been ambushed by people seeking financial advantage. Her lawyers challenged the trust claim. They couldn't erase the DNA, but they could slow everything to a crawl, demanding additional testing, questioning whether the adoption records had been handled properly, requesting a review of every message between Grace and my daughter. The Porsche sat in legal limbo, a $250,000 prop nobody could touch. Weeks became months. Nora postponed her start date at the clinic in Columbus. Then she postponed it again. She gave blood samples. She signed affidavits. She answered the same questions in the same rooms until the strain settled permanently into her face. One evening, I found her at my kitchen table, drowning in documents. You can walk away, honey, I said. You don't need the money. You never did. She didn't look up. That's what she wants. Then let her have it. Let it go. She set down her pen. Mom, if I walk away, she gets to decide that making my life hard enough is the same as making me disappear. Again. She finally met my eyes. It was never about the money, and I understood. My daughter was not fighting for a fortune. She was fighting for the right not to be erased simply because she was inconvenient to someone powerful. She had spent her first 8 years being moved from house to house because adults found it easier. She would not be moved again. I stopped telling her to let go after that. The thing about a lie buried in a company's books is that it does not stay buried once people start digging. Vivienne's own lawyers had reopened the estate, and the reopening cut both ways. An internal review found that Ashford Group had paid the investigators who tracked my daughter for 18 years the surveillance filed under risk management. Company money spent watching a child. The company had no business watching. The board could not ignore it. It became a governance problem, then a headline, then a liability. She did not lose everything overnight. Real life rarely works that neatly. But the woman who had built her life on control watched some of that control slip through her fingers. She stepped aside from daily operations while the board investigated. The same paper trail she'd used to find Nora was now being used to unmake her. I felt no triumph watching it. I want to tell you I did. It would make a cleaner story, but mostly I felt tired and sad. For the years everyone had lost to a secret that could have been a phone call. 6 months after the graduation, Grace called while Nora and I were eating chili at my kitchen table. She put it on speaker. "The trustee has approved the claim," Grace said. "Fully." Nora closed her eyes. I reached across the table and took her hand. "There's one more thing," Grace added. "Vivienne has requested a meeting before the final papers are signed." A pause. No lawyers, no assistants. She says she wants to come alone. Nora opened her eyes and looked at me. 6 months earlier, I would have laughed at the idea of Vivienne Ashford going anywhere alone. Nora chose a diner off an old highway, the kind of place where truckers stop for coffee before dawn. Vivienne arrived 5 minutes early, and I almost didn't recognize her. The expensive suits were gone dark jeans, a plain sweater, no one trailing behind her. She looked older, not from wrinkles, from something heavier. She wrapped both hands around a coffee mug and said she'd rehearsed this 100 times. And every version sounded like a defense, so she stopped defending. "I spent 18 years telling myself I left because I had no choice," she said. There was some truth in it. Richard's family swore you weren't his. They threatened everything. "But that's not why I stayed away." She looked at Nora. "I stayed away because every year it got harder to come back. And when I learned you were safe with Ruth, I told myself that made it all right. It didn't. I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting myself. I was terrified of seeing the damage I'd done." No excuse followed. Just 2 words. "I'm sorry." Nora watched her for a long moment. "I believe you're sorry," she said. "But being sorry isn't the same as pretending it didn't happen." The hope in Vivienne's face faded into something quieter acceptance. Nora laid out her terms. She wasn't moving into the Ashford house. She wasn't changing her name or joining the company. She would keep working as a therapist. Vivienne would not show up at Ruth's door without asking. She would not send gifts to fix the past. She would never once call Ruth my adoptive mother, and she would never lie about what happened. Vivienne agreed to all of it without hesitation. Before she left, she placed a folded paper on the table, her personal number, no assistance. "If either of you ever wants to talk," she said, Call me directly. Nora took it. She didn't promise anything. Neither did I. Sometimes forgiveness isn't a hug or tears. Sometimes it's just leaving one door unlocked. A month after the papers were signed, Nora paid off the mortgage on my house. I argued for 3 days. I don't need you covering my bills, I told her. She smiled. You didn't raise me, so I'd owe you. You raised me so I'd know how to take care of people. I couldn't find an argument after that. One spring morning, she drove me out to the lake. Tied to the dock was a used aluminum fishing boat. Nothing fancy, a little dented, about the right size. She tossed me the keys. You kept your promise, I said. No, she laughed. You kept yours. We spent the whole afternoon catching almost nothing. It was perfect. Before we drove home, she asked me to take one picture not beside the lake, not beside the boat, but beside my old car, the one that had carried us through 18 years of ordinary Tuesdays. That photo sits on my fireplace now. People ask why there's no picture of the Porsche, or the Ashford estate, or the day my daughter inherited enough to change her life. The answer is simple. Those things changed her future. The old car reminds us who carried her there. Blood explains where a child begins. It cannot explain who stays. Richard gave her a name in a will. Vivienne gave her life. But only one person gave her a place to come home to. I was lucky enough to be the one who stayed. If someone in your life proved that family is built by love instead of blood, tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. And sometimes those stories are the ones that remind us what actually matters. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe. I'll keep telling stories about the people who chose to stay. We could all use a few more of them.